great people on.
And then I hit this one, right? Oop.
Yeah, I think so.
There we are, and then making sure the window doesn't like obscure too much. Do this one. Oh,
I can go back.
it distracted you. Oh, just do that. That should be fine. And then I think this top bar is going to be there.
I think it'll disappear after.
There we are.
Oh, cool.
This should, and then make sure it still goes back and forth on the slides. I think I can click back on the window. Again.
Okay, yep.
All right. Tech should be all good now. Welcome everyone. Please take food. We want to
No.
we have donuts and pupusas. Please take some.
I was like, really?
More could you ever need?
Do we have plates too?
Yeah.
Plates are like somewhere in front of me and I can't see them.
Where'd you get the donuts from?
Donut king.
Oh,
I think with the classic.
thank you.
Hi,
My name is Jay.
Jay.
Yeah.
Nice to
My
meet you.
full name is Andre. And I go by here.
Awesome.
So I totally cannot comprehend international sort of science research. So.
Oh, awesome. No, I'm super excited to be
Yeah.
here.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you for
Yeah.
helping all this together.
Yeah, no worries.
Yeah,
It's really
so glad we
exciting.
could- I'm so glad
I
we
don't
could
think I help much, but
Well, it happened. And
yeah.
your name is on the thing, so
That's great.
you get credit. But yeah.
I'm
You'll be
ecstatic to be here.
anyway.
Yeah, well, thank you for being here.
You
Did you have your other engagement with
At
USC?
USC is on Wednesday.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
great.
Thank you. And then
They're doing your introductions.
yeah. Yeah, I think we'll get started. Let me try. Oh, I got do one more chord. Sorry. Okay. Here we are. That should be good now. Okay, so we've got both sides. You should be able to hear me or anyone from anywhere in the room, although I suspect they're not going to be doing many circles. But you're welcome to.
Okay.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this talk. We're really excited to have Professor Nick John Ramos here to present his talk on emergent economies and emergency medicine. Nick is a historian of medicine whose first book, Health as Property, came out in December 2025. He's going to present work from the end of that book and possibly dovetailing into a future project on health as property, emergency medicine as a property of whiteness, and the racial geography of capitalism in Los Angeles.
Thank you all. I feel really, really blessed to be here. Although I graduated with a PhD at USC, UCLA has really, I was just telling, folks, thanks to the folks who organized this, Ben, Matt, Marsha Meldrum, Philippe Bourgeois, like all the folks who I've ever met, Russell Johnson, like there's so many people at UCLA who helped be book doulas in many ways to this book. That actually had presented multiple versions of this talk. So now you're seeing like a kind of final, fully formed talk here from my book, which is out. You could get it at UC Press website. And if you use author 40 at checkout, that's AUTHOR40, you can get it for 40% off using my discount code. Okay. So today I'm going to talk about emergent medicine, emergent economies, the political whiteness of emergency medicine in globalizing Los Angeles. And I'll just begin. Okay. In 1989, Chicago Tribune writer Mike Royko used his daily column to laud the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors' recent decision to renew a military agreement using King Drew Medical Center's Trauma Unit and Emergency Medicine Department in Watts as a training ground for combat-bound Army surgeons. Since the rise of citizen-led tax revolts in the late 70s, taxpayers increasingly viewed publicly supported emergency medical services in low-income neighborhoods as fiscally wasteful and ideologically misguided as either despised form of quote-unquote welfare services, such as public housing, education, and hospital and clinic services. However, unlike most liberal progressive who argued for emergency medicine's importance for public health objectives, Royko marshaled a defense for emergency medicine by underlining its greater significance to public safety. Okay. According to him, public funding for emergency medicine was necessary to convert the number of gunshot wounds and stabbing victims into Watts into the raw clinical material to, quote, prepare every Army doctor for at least World War II.5. If and when the shooting starts, he declared, the Army must have doctors who know how to treat bullet wounds. In mounting such a defense, Royko helped illustrate how increased research and innovation within the field of emergency medicine since the 1960s had made it possible for American hospitals to build and sustain labor and technical arrangements previously seen only in US military field hospitals in Asia, Africa, and Latin America since World War II. King Drew's emergency medicine infrastructure contributed to this history in a new and novel way by transforming the Black and brown youth, quote, who came out on the losing end of a disagreement between gang members into making its emergency department, quote, about as close to a genuine wartime medical situation as anything this side of Lebanon or Colombia. According to Royko, Watts provided clinicians with, quote, the kinds of gaping, multiple wounds caused by automatic and semi-automatic gunfire that our Army surgeons could expect during war, but, quote unquote, rarely got to see while training in, quote unquote, peacetime conditions. Rather than limit itself to Los Angeles, Royko thus argued readers, politicians in other cities, in large cities like New York, Chicago, Detroit, Washington, and Miami, to view the quote-unquote gang mayhem in their cities in a similar manner as an untapped resource for military surgeons to, quote, get a taste of real war without the inconvenience of traveling abroad, and as an opportunity for taxpayers to salute the otherwise nameless young Black and brown youth who unwittingly and unknowingly offered their main bodies, quote unquote, for their country. Whew. As my presentation today will show, Royko's recognition of emergency medicine's significance to protecting and preserving whiteness, white life, and property by the late 80s reveals a different purpose for King Drew's medical services than the one originally intended for it when it opened in 1972. Built as a response to the 1965 Watts uprisings, politicians, health policy leaders, and local activists originally designed King Drew as an anti-poverty program aimed at raising the health standards of Black neighborhoods by prioritizing the education and employment needs of Black male heads of households. Inspired by Daniel P. Moynihan's culture of poverty theory, King Drew's original mission sought to, quote unquote, cure Black families of poverty and poor health by empowering Black male doctors and Black male breadwinners to lead Black neighborhoods out of poverty. To do this, its proponents reasoned longitudinal investment in education, training, and employing Black men would work alongside expanded temporary assistance programs like housing, healthcare, and welfare benefits for women and children to make Black neighborhoods as independent and self-sustaining as white neighborhoods. King Drew's postgraduate medical and allied health services school exemplified this vision by targeting Black men for education, training, and employment as emergency medicine physicians, paramedics, and emergency medicine staff, and by giving Black consumers access to hospital services through preventative health clinics. In this vision of change, medical practitioners prescribe full employment and public access to comprehensive preventative and acute healthcare as antidotes to poverty and violence in a way that made gun and knife injuries preventable and provided precautionary measures to anticipate avoidable health conditions. I argue that the rise of emergency medicine caused white voters by the 1980s to reverse their interest in funding general hospital and clinic services for the poor in order to fund emergency medical systems in spaces where private funding for such services could not be assured. In so doing, white voters signaled a new way of thinking about poverty that instead of eradicating or alleviating it through 1960s anti-poverty programs, they turned to accept it and its biomedical effects by the 1970s as normal and expected features of everyday life by medicalizing the higher frequency of violence, trauma, and gun violence associated with living in a quote-unquote new global economy. King Drew's turn towards serving as a premier site of medical research and training for emergency medicine serves as the critical endpoint to my book, Health as Property, Racial Capitalism and Sexual Liberalism in Los Angeles, with the University of California Press's American Crossroads series. My book reveals a racially and sexually liberal coalition of medical and political leaders, such as Black Councilman turned Mayor Tom Bradley and his white county supervisor Kenneth Hahn, made decisions about the healthcare of people living in Black neighborhoods, not based on what residents in them considered good for themselves, but based on whether they believe white voters and taxpayers would tolerate or support their decisions over Black healthcare outright. By the late 1970s, Derek Bell famously referred to this phenomena as only investing in advancing in the interest of Black people so long as it served the interest of white voters as the quote-unquote interest convergence dilemma. With the exception of welfare rights activists, my book shows that in order to make health as much of a property of Blackness as whiteness, that Black elites and white liberals felt pressed to serve white voters and their interests because they believed it was necessary to win their consent for any Black freedom dream to become reality. My book traces how several contending strands of the Black freedom movement, including those emanating out of the civil rights, Black power, and welfare rights movement, jockeyed for control of the hospital. Like a loan requiring more credit, however, Black leaders and their allies found they needed more money to fight the scale of poverty and illness fostered under racial capitalism than most white citizens were willing to part with. The book traces how the planning, construction, and operation of King Drew unfolded right as the nation underwent a profound economic transformation. We know from the work of Ruth Wilson Gilmore that the rise of LA as a global city took place as the nation's economy transitioned away from a manufacturing economy to one pinned to a new so-called service industry centered on global finance capital. Instead of valorized workers who produced material goods, this new economy valorized college-educated workers, such as those in finance, real estate, and insurance, whose talent and services help lubricate the transaction of capital around the world. According to Gilmore, this restructuring led to higher rates of unemployment, working poverty, and homelessness because workers found themselves unable to retool themselves quickly enough for a new economy or found that the jobs they could take were plentiful but low paying and temporary. Rather than respond to these crises as a problem of economic restructuring, Gilmore argues voters responded to them as a problem of race by calling for quote unquote smaller government and by voting to cage and deport more people of color. In 1978, California voters passed Proposition 13, a referendum cutting public taxes to just 1%. As Gilmore argues, cutting taxes using quote unquote smaller government rhetoric did not actually result in smaller government. Politicians and taxpayers cut funds to public and social services, such as highway and street maintenance, sanitation services, and public health and education services, but increased funds to build prisons, employ more public safety officers, and securitize state hospitals. Rather than result in less government spending, these processes simply represented a different kind of government spending. We're kind of in the same, y'all, this is, we could talk about connections today. Historians credit both Bradley and Hahn with helping LA's white suburban citizens avoid the most devastating spatial effects of this process through racial inclusion programs. I'll explain what I'm talking about, racial inclusion programs. Whereas other cities experienced major economic and population decline, Bradley in particular sought to harness the nation's economic transition to generate new employment opportunities in neighborhoods of color. As a migrant from Texas who had arrived as a young boy to LA in 1924, Bradley had witnessed how poverty deepened as jobs and capital moved away from the inner city toward racially exclusive suburban developments. Since his election to the city council in 1961, all his efforts to entice large-scale employers to return and hire workers of color had largely failed except for an urban revitalization program aimed at making a downtown neighborhood known as Bunker Hill the site of a new international financial district. By the late 1960s, Bradley turned from advertising Black and brown neighborhoods as sites worthy of investment towards advertising them as cheap and plentiful repositories of labor. He fell quiet on demands around equal pay and started supporting policies feminist labor scholars refer to as the feminization of poverty phenomena. Feminization of poverty names all the ways that politicians and employers began valorizing women of color workers and quote unquote women's work for the profit margins that quote unquote women's wages represented for bosses in a restructuring economy. Instead of rely on the labor of men to power economic change, as was done between the 1930s and 1960s, employers and politicians in the 1970s helped motor the economy we have today by hiding extractive labor practices in plain sight. That is, by the 1980s, employers and politicians successfully achieved the lowering and suppression of wages for all workers, regardless of their race or gender, by valorizing quote unquote women's wages and the labor of women of color, by taking advantage of society's general acceptance that women of color make less than men of color and white women, and that white women and men of color make less than white men. King Drew's Health Services served as a keystone for helping city leaders give birth to LA's new economy by marrying employers' needs for cheap labor with poor people's individual desire to survive a restructuring economy. Together with public housing and improved transportation services, LA's public hospitals and clinics played a key role in keeping LA's labor market a competitive destination for multinational corporations by unburdening them from the responsibility of paying wages and benefits high enough for Black workers to lift themselves out of poverty. I'll just stop here to just say that this map shows you all of the clinics that they're using to anchor working poverty in neighborhoods of color alongside the city's redevelopment zones, which are these like blocks up here in the upper left-hand corner. And you can quite see how they're using neighborhoods of color as the augur to create a global city. That's what this map is showing. My research shows Black, gay, Asian, and Chicano leaders, community leaders supported Bradley's policies because his efforts to expand services in low-income neighborhoods answered their long-held demands for public investment in neighborhoods of color. In contrast to when employment opportunities were far from neighborhoods of color, the city's leaders also welcomed the return of capital to city centers because they regarded it as some work in a they regarded quote unquote some work in a chaotic economy as better than no work at all. It also, more importantly, was seen as a way to combat racist stereotypes of people of color as lazy grifters by showing how workers of color were now visibly equal contributors to the city's new economy through their participation as workers, albeit at the lowest rung. My intervention in urban history shows these policy objectives were not meant to gentrify neighborhoods of color by replacing poor Black residents with higher income white residents, nor were they intended to raise the poor into the middle class, but were instead intended to harness and manage poverty's productive capacity to drive economic change elsewhere. These measures demonstrate what Clyde Adrian Woods calls the quote unquote resilience of plantation relations through capitalism's capacity to renew itself through new regional alliances that emerge in response to capitalist crisis. In the case of Los Angeles, a new crop of intercity political leaders allied themselves with downtown's financial elite to, quote, restore and reproduce their profitability and power by arresting the economic development of neighborhoods of color to manage poverty's productive capacity to make other neighborhoods and regions productive. Thus, rather than regard underdevelopment as the absence of capitalist development, LA's multicultural leaders helped illustrate how capitalist development occurs, as Manning Marable has argued, not in spite of the exclusion of Blacks, but because of the brutal exploitation of Blacks as workers and consumers. This story matters because it shows how an economy built on the backs of poor women of color, particularly poor Black and brown women, has led to what labor scholars refer to as the race to the bottom, and has led to an economy that relies on the incapacitation of poor men of color through policing and incarceration, particularly that of poor Black and brown men, to make other sectors of labor and other pieces of real estate outside prisons productive and profitable. Similar to prisons, my work shows that the expansion of public health institutions after the 1960s, such as mental health services in Skid Row, public clinics and emergency departments in low-income neighborhoods, worked with policing to make LA's private health systems profitable by containing poverty in ways that made poverty productive despite its unprofitability. Oh yeah, sorry, that was that slide, okay? Sorry about that. I'll let you look at that while I take a glass of water here. White taxpayer desire for emergency medical services over true universal basic health care and prisons and policing over full employment and housing reveals a deep willingness to expand certain parts of the state associated with public safety over other parts of the state associated with welfare, not out of economic rationality or government efficiency, but because such state services constitute a quote-unquote common good that obfuscates what Daniel Hosang refers to as the privileges and preferences funneled to quote-unquote political whiteness. Hosang defines political whiteness as, quote, a formulation of political subjectivity, identity, and community in which whiteness functions as an absent referent within the putatively neutral and abstract terms of liberalism. Politicians and voters, for instance, made race-neutral appeals. I don't know what happened. Maybe it's, oh, there you go. For instance, made race-neutral appeals to political whiteness by claiming that publicly funded emergency medicine, unlike locally situated and geographically bound public hospitals and clinics, served everyone for any ailment at any time and any place. Such appeals, however, obfuscated how publicly funded emergency medical services expanded and guaranteed emergency medicine as a new service that complemented insured white people's access to private hospital and clinic services while increasingly limiting poor people of color's access to just one entry point for care, the emergency department. Essentially, I'm saying that this is like a white subsidy. The fact of smaller government discourses by the 80s was thus less successful in producing a smaller state than in producing a landscape of relative health, safety, and security for mostly white citizens who used the ballot box to insulate themselves and their property from the normalization of gun violence and poverty produced by global economic restructuring in neighborhoods of color. Despite all efforts by politicians, physicians, and activists in the city's neighborhoods of colors in the 1970s to demonstrate a shared commitment to health, normality, and sexual respectability, white suburban and rural voters in the 1980s empowered a new set of leaders at both local and national levels, such as conservative county supervisor Peter Shabaram and President Ronald Reagan, to carry out policies that literally and figuratively police the boundaries between whiteness and race with larger police outfits. The cumulative effect of these relationships helped popularize and make profitable emergency medicine in the region's outlying white suburban hospitals, while kept the region's least profitable and sickest patients trapped in what most public health experts increasingly refer to as King Drew's quote-unquote safety net. The book thus examines King Drew's health system at the crossroads of two contradictory phenomenon. It traces, on one hand, the growing representation of Black people and other racial and sexual minorities in prominent positions in politics, medicine, and mainstream society after the 1960s, and the revitalization and growth of working poverty, medical discrimination, police harassment, caging, and deportation for poor people of color, queer and trans people of color, and the undocumented by the 1980s on the other. My examination of King Drew's health services shows that health policy in the United States, especially around Black health, remains tightly connected to labor policy, and as labor policy, health policy cannot be extracted nor separated from the relations of property and real estate that govern the distribution of health services in any given city. The irony of my findings show that the point of providing biomedical services to poor communities of color often had very little to do with addressing the immediate health needs of the poor and needy. The history of King Drew demonstrates that medical services served at various points as a subtext for profitable investment, an excuse to carry out broader real estate development schemes, or as a vehicle to solve political and social problems larger than poor health and illness itself. In the end, my analysis shows that white voters decided the meaning of biomedical services in the city's poor neighborhoods in ways that left Black residents exposed to greater health risks. Now that I've given you a short overview of the book, I'm going to trace the changing meaning of King Drew's health services by outlining two types of political whiteness: a racially liberal form by way of County Supervisor Kenneth Hahn, and a racially conservative form by way of Los Angeles County Fire Chief turned paramedic consultant James O. Page. I'll use their stories to trace the evolution of emergency medicine from Vietnam to Watts, and Watts to Middle America and back. I'll end by showing how the entrance convergence between both Hahn's and Page's forms of political whiteness made Black residents of South Los Angeles more vulnerable to premature death than was originally intended. Okay. So it's well known that medical experts began developing the proper arrangement of technology, labor, and knowledge to treat gunshot wounds, injuries, and other forms of somatic trauma as early as World War II. By the 1950s, advances in patient transport, evacuation, and surgical know-how were gathered and enhanced during the Korean War through what the US military referred to as Mobile Army Surgical Hospitals. We know them as MASH. Although these advances at the edges of US empire demonstrated how medical experts had developed an understanding of how highly specialized physicians could be brought together to quickly and successfully triage, treat, and stabilize patients with traumatic injuries, few people could imagine the need and appetite for such a costly around-the-clock service for citizens living in the empire's metropole during the 1950s and early 1960s. Indeed, when County Supervisor Kenneth Hahn rose to support the construction of King Drew in the wake of the uprisings, he did so not to normalize the violence associated with poverty, but to eradicate it through larger job employment programs for Black men. Hahn supported the plan offered by Black physicians to help Black men lead their families out of poverty and into health through an elaborate hospital and clinic plan that offered men jobs as well as mentorship on how to consume health services responsibly through clinic programs centered on preventative health. The goal of training Black men and their families to use health services responsibly was, on one hand, a part of a larger mission by Black elites to prove the sexual modernity of Black citizens by illustrating their capacity to exercise economic rationality and sexual responsibility. Prioritizing preventative health was also, on the other hand, a key selling point for anti-poverty proponents who sought to regulate and limit access to expensive public hospital services to protect white taxpayers' interests as Black neighborhoods develop economically into independent neighborhoods. Working with Black political and medical leaders, Hahn led efforts in the wake of the Watts uprisings to pass Proposition A, a 1966 county referendum to fund a Black-led academic medical center with voter-approved funds. However, after some white citizens distributed "Don't Reward Rioting" bumper stickers, claiming the proposition served as a form of quote-unquote racial blackmail designed to hold white voters hostage for services they believed Black people had neither earned nor deserved, Proposition A fell just short of passing. Hahn feared the rejection not only signaled a potential return to rioting, but also feared that white voters' unwillingness to fund a hospital in poor neighborhoods signaled the end of California's nearly 100-year period of investing in public hospital construction. To solve the problem of return rioting, Hahn immediately announced plans to enter into a joint agreement with the city of LA to build a hospital without voter approval. To solve the possible problem of no more new public hospitals, Hahn approached LA County's fire warden to see if its fleet of rescue vehicles could be retrofitted to extend the reach of existing hospitals through new mobile paramedic units. That means let's use what we have and extend the range, right? His idea for modern paramedic services, however, would not take off until after the assassination of Bobby Kennedy in 1968. His assassination in the ballroom of the Ambassador Hotel at 2:10 a.m. triggered the dispatch of 2 ambulance attendants from LA's Central Receiving Hospital. However, after retrieving him, Central Receiving's physicians called to transfer him at 12:30 a.m. to Good Samaritan Hospital, Good Sam, after realizing they did not have the blood plasma and x-ray equipment needed to treat him. Crazy, right? Although Good Sam had the equipment needed, Kennedy was not treated until surgeons were roused from their beds at home and ready to perform surgery at 2:45 a.m. After 3 hours and 45 minutes of surgery, Kennedy was pronounced dead. The missed opportunity to save Kennedy's life illustrated how emergency room systems prior to the late 60s lacked the sophistication and coordination required to treat critically ill and injured patients. As Matthew Edwards has argued, pre-hospital care before the late 60s, quote, emphasized speedy and reliable transportation without treatment and used hospital transporters in jobs that had no formal requirements and lacked even basic first aid training. I know, people are like, what? This is true, okay? As the architecture of Good Samaritan's intensive care unit revealed, the few hospitals capable of addressing critically ill or injured patients before the 70s often reserved the talent, labor, and resources to address them for insured patients scheduled for operations during the day. Most emergency rooms of the era were thus understood as services where working class people without health insurance could access care after regular hours with physicians who picked up work to supplement wages they were unable to obtain through regular work. The embarrassment of Kennedy's death directly led Hahn to win money for 2 simultaneously run, federally funded pilot paramedic demonstration programs that helped reconstitute technology and systems developed elsewhere and for other purposes into one coherent new purpose to address heart attacks, dubbed one of the 3 most frequent reasons for morbidity in the United States. The first project deployed vehicles designed to see if an operating room could be placed on wheels. It utilized private hospitals and private ambulance firms in conjunction with paramedic-trained fire department personnel to demonstrate the viability of adapting hospital systems in municipalities where services were mostly privately funded. The second emphasized time by augmenting refurbished rescue vehicles with paramedic-trained fire department personnel with portable versions of operating room tools to demonstrate the viability of adapting hospital systems in municipalities where services were mostly publicly funded. Hahn's grant allowed officials to pull equipment formerly used in isolation towards new uses in mobile units. Hahn's fire department, quote unquote, rescue vehicles pulled defibrillators and electrocardiogram machines used in operating rooms for cardiac arrest, carried sirens, gurneys, and various medical splits used in fire rescue operations, and deployed 2-way radios used in military operations, into automobiles repurposed as modern ambulances. Han was careful to make sure that residents using the services in his districts knew that the service was a new feature of the county's public services, that their vehicles were not like the ambulance they were accustomed to, and that its staff were not drivers but quote unquote paramedics, a word he preferred over emergency medical technicians because it connected people's imagination to soldiering in Korea and Vietnam. He did so because he sought to prime voters to accept the expansion of counties' fire paramedic programs as part of a larger ploy to employ Black veterans returning from Vietnam as paramedics and to construct a new paramedic base station in Watts. Han's efforts to connect Vietnam to Watts was more than just a ploy to transfer the skills of soldiering abroad to jobs back at home. Such domestic policies not only sought to make war abroad productive for a larger amount of people of color abandoned by the nation's economy by the 60s, but also helped account for the economy that people of color would confront by the 1970s and 80s. Indeed, war alongside the New Deal and GI Bill served as the means for manufacturing economies to abscond to white suburbs by the late 60s and would serve as the means to exacerbate employment by relocating even more manufacturers abroad by the 1970s. Han's faith in emergency medicine's ability to connect marginalized neighborhoods to far-flung hospitals and employ people of color demonstrated how he did not believe imperialism and racial inclusion to be antithetical terms to each other. Han saw emergency medicine as a service that would make up for the shortcomings of a manufacturing economy by serving as a means to employ more Black men in healthcare as doctors, technicians, and workers, or union-protected fire departments as paramedics. He also believed emergency medical services would enhance rather than erode the significance of hospitals and clinics, while at the same time restore the public faith in efficient government by offering a public service that worked with private companies to maximize existing resources for a common good. By 1970, the service was so popular that Han began to contract the county fire department paramedic services to cities not covered by its jurisdiction. Han's approach did not anticipate how innovation in pre-hospital care would eventually lead to innovation in emergency medicine. In 1971, LA County USC Medical Center inaugurated the first emergency medicine program for doctors, for training program for doctors. The program led to the migration of medical experts once found deep within the hospital's cost-controlled operating rooms to essentially a new, unpredictable, and unregulated cost center closer, so to speak, to the streets. Although nominally on the same grounds as hospitals, the around-the-clock presence of a team of physician specialists make emergency departments essentially an extremely expensive mini hospital within a hospital. Rather than make hospital services more efficient and accessible, the concentration of talent and technology in emergency medical systems made health services more expensive and more exclusive than Han originally intended. The story of emergency medicine's rising costs can be traced by following the racially conservative politics of James O. Page, a retired fire chief who worked as one of the first paramedics in Han's pilot paramedic projects. Page went on, the papers are here, y'all, at UCLA, by the way. Russell Johnson can help you look at them. Page went on to consult for a popular television show, Emergency, which dramatized the adventures of paramedic fireman Johnny Cage, based on Page and played by Randolph Mantooth, and Roy DeSoto, played by Kevin Teague of Squad 51. Emergency premiered in 1972, the same year as another popular show, MASH, which dramatized the same life-saving capabilities as LA's emergency medicine services on the battlefields of Korea. Like the legacy lives on through the pit today. After retiring in 1972, Page worked to innovate and replicate LA's emergency medical systems in mostly rural and suburban neighborhoods across the United States by serving as first a bureaucrat charged with building emergency medicine programs, and then as a lobbyist for the Advanced Coronary Treatment Foundation, a special interest group dedicated to expanding emergency medicine. The popularity of emergency helped Page to shape a different future for emergency medicine than the one originally envisioned by Hahn. Whereas Hahn aimed to develop emergency medical services as a new publicly funded service to extend the reach of existing hospitals and employ more veterans of color, Page encouraged citizens to explore creating emergency medical systems in the quickest and most efficient way possible. By 1976, he began arguing that his experience establishing new systems had, quote, clearly shown the reality that quality in an EMS system did not require uniformity of role throughout the nation. He pointed out, for instance, that the Grand Rapids Police Department in Michigan and the Dallas and Houston Fire Departments in Texas ran their paramedic services just as well as commercial ambulance companies in Palm Springs, California. So you can see here that in Detroit and in parts of Michigan, paramedics are the police, and other places they're the fire department. Early on, Page also encouraged quote unquote activists seeking to develop emergency medicine to be wary of affirmative action programs designed to benefit veterans and workers of color. He lamented, for instance, that North Carolina's EMS directors were too quote unquote overly concerned for equity and equality in hiring. He suggested that while, quote, former military medics might appear on the basis of written statements and training experience to be ready to easily transfer their military skills to a quote unquote civilian atmosphere, he found that most veterans failed to accomplish the transition because they lacked the intellectual capacity to work, quote, without day-to-day supervision and follow, quote, standard operating procedures. He argued instead that activists focus on hiring employees who were, quote, highly motivated, sensitive, and socially acceptable professionals and technicians who see themselves as a team and who tend to exhibit a special form of pride and dedication to their work. Page's efforts to discourage racial equity and equality in hiring policies were significant because he worked hard to institute new employment policies that preserve the historical white racial character of public safety occupations, especially since changes in the economy made good-paying middle-class jobs less secure for white working-class men. As anti-tax sentiment around Prop 13 increasingly threatened to undermine the budgets of fire and police departments across the nation, Page encouraged fire and police chiefs to consider defending public safety and fire protection funding by expanding their services to include some level of what he called advanced life support services. Pointing to exemplary firefighting units in Wichita, Kansas, and Santa Monica, California, Page advocated for every firefighter to be trained in, quote, basic life support, a level of training below that of a paramedic, but above that of a basic first aid. And for every fire truck and pumper to be outfitted with paramedic gear. Page explained that these initiatives transformed every firefighter and police officer into medical personnel he referred to as, quote, first responders, because their spatial coverage and likely proximity to people in distress made their survival before trained paramedics more likely. He was inspired to weave all firefighting and police units into a larger and a more alert medical system after following a North Carolina paramedic unit to a house of a woman suffering from a heart attack where, quote, several overfed firemen sat 5 houses down, quote, in wicker chairs, looking curiously at the ambulance that was coming and passing them. So he's really anointing all police and fire personnel as medical personnel through the language of first responders. Page was keen to blur the responsibilities between public safety officers and medical personnel because, as he put it, publicly funded fire departments could, quote, no longer exist on smoke and water alone. And because, quote, the ratio of life-threatening emergencies in hospital departments was, quote, unquote, relatively small. According to his own estimates, while only 5% of patients who use emergency medical services turn out to be genuine medical emergencies, and only 4% of reported fires turn out to be working fires, Page argued that emergency medical systems came to, quote, to the fire service at a time when it was increasingly difficult to justify an expensive body or personnel for the occasional single function of fire protection. By linking public safety duties, I want to keep there. The linking of public safety duties with the EMS was increasingly important because the cost of the EMS services was quickly growing. Although few calls to paramedic units and few visits to emergency departments constituted genuine medical emergencies in the eyes of medical professionals, Page's interactions with tax-paying citizens reveal an insatiable appetite for more and more expensive personnel and technology. Despite such high costs, Page observed that many municipal officials continued to press him about the possibility of adding helicopter and air evacuation, a service he understood received a lot of extravagant praise and drama on television, but felt obliged to admit was impractical given the economics, geography, and weather of many locations throughout the US. Meaning basically like people were willing to just give up all this money for technology they didn't actually really need. The importance of emergency medicine to national interest led King Drew's leaders to follow recommendations offered in 1972 by the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare and the Commonwealth Foundation to abandon its mission as an anti-poverty program and turn its attention to focusing, quote unquote, on health. By on health, policy analysis meant addressing homicides, the fourth biggest reason for morbidity in Watts. From 72 to 78, Los Angeles County converted King Drew's emergency room into a full-fledged emergency medicine department that culminated in the opening of an emergency medicine residency program. By the early 80s, over half of King Drew's trauma caseload victims of street violence were victims of street violence, and the department boasted an impressive save rate of 97.6% and 97.9% in 1981 and 1982, respectively. By 84, acting emergency medicine chief Dr. Subramaniam Balasubramaniam proclaimed King Drew was seen to be such, quote, a leader in the field of emergency medicine that it was one of the few residency programs in the nation, quote, able to pick the cream of the crop to train as residents. The spectacular save rates helped advertise and demonstrate the power of new emergency medical services to white suburbanites. For insured white patients, emergency medicine authenticated the false belief that the care one received in a particular hospital with such services made those services modern, cutting edge, and sophisticated. Speaking in 82, Page recalled that hospitals reacted to this belief by making makeshift emergency rooms as marketing tools to fill empty beds. The problem with such marketing is that it caused patients to be sent to hospitals unequipped and unprepared to handle critically ill and injured patients despite being advertised as an emergency hospital. So this shows you where all of the hospitals that say they have an emergency room are, but only about 15 of them actually have the capacity to handle critically ill patients in 82. The profit motive and costs associated with emergency medicine's spatial unevenness caused emergency medicine's proponents to be much more spatially aware of the physical location and quality of emergency medicine departments than of their profitability. As Page reminded proponents in 79, emergency medical systems only work when, quote, multiple components, pre-hospital, in-hospital, and inter-hospital work together. For emergency medicine's proponents, it was thus less important for policymakers to regulate who advertised themselves as an emergency hospital, and more important to direct public funding to sustain emergency departments in regions where it was well known to be difficult to operate a hospital, let alone an emergency department. The need to ensure that an emergency department remained operational in South Los Angeles, where only a handful of private hospitals existed, and where even fewer were willing to provide emergency care for poor and indigent patients, meant that emergency medicine's proponents increasingly focused their efforts on funding King Drew's emergency department. Rather than see all the services offered at King Drew as equally employment for all citizens in LA, Page took a decidedly antagonistic position against the further funding of public hospital and clinic services he considered not essential to the operation of emergency medicine. Speaking to attendees of a Houston conference in the wake of nationwide budget cuts, Page encouraged emergency medicine proponents to see health education, especially preventative health education, like that offered within King Drew's health clinics, as, quote, one of government's biggest failures. Drawing on well-worn racist beliefs that people of color were incapable of self-governance and hygiene, Page insisted that public funding would be better put to use to serve those he considered responsible, alluding to the now persistent belief that poor people of color lack the proper motivation and willpower to lift themselves out of poverty. Page argued that, quote, probably more than any other factor, health education's perceived failure in neighborhoods of color could be, quote, traced to a lack of individual motivation. And since, quote, all learning is tied to motivation, that people who are not motivated, not motivated to accept personal responsibility for their own health are not likely to learn how. As he put it, the failure of our government to change lifestyles, change personal habits, improve diet, while at the same time promising quality health for all citizens has resulted in an economic imbalance that could easily break our nation. Page's strategically deployed comments amid nationwide deliberations over the distribution of tax revenues show how this decades-long interaction with helping most white, suburban, and rural community leaders build emergency medical systems in their neighborhoods shaped his imagination about whom he believed emergency medicine's true constituents were. His statements repeatedly cast those who exclusively use publicly funded hospital and clinic services as immutably unhygienic and irresponsible citizens, while painting putatively white voters and homeowners as beneficiaries of emergency medicine's life-saving services, and suggesting that white homeowners or taxpayers were somehow more motivated and educated about how to keep themselves individually healthy. Page intimated that white citizens were entitled to services to treat medical, quote-unquote, emergencies and accidents they otherwise could not reasonably predict or prevent on their own. In Page's imagination, publicly funded emergency medical services seemed a particularly important entitlement for insured white patients who regularly traverse neighborhoods of color between home and work. Such observations made King Drew's emergency medical services of paramount importance because without public funding, commuters faced being stranded in a region that few private hospitals even dared to serve. This is a moment before the imperial, the 105 existed. Yeah. So people had to get to the airport, drive through neighborhoods of color. Page's statements helped frame the rationale behind the county's cuts to public hospital and clinic care when Prop 13's cuts hit LA in 81 and when President Reagan cut federal funding in 84. In response to the tax crisis that public funding, hospital funding for clinics, hospitals, and EMS throughout the 70s created for taxpayers, my research shows municipal leaders began to dismantle and eliminate King Drew's public health programs and clinics in order to keep publicly funded emergency medical departments alive by closing 8 public clinics while maintaining funding levels to public safety departments. From the perspective of residents in low-income neighborhoods, these cuts shrunk the vision of offering the full complement of health services to the poor to just one access point, the emergency department, while helped expand the complement of comprehensive health services for the insured to include emergency medical services, fully paid for by taxpayers. Together with the rise of policing and prisons, these investments show that white voters only seemed willing to invest in Black neighborhoods so long as they had something to do with policing or emergency medicine. In this regard, popular depictions associating emergency medicine with those on welfare and the undocumented unfairly obscure its development as a service underwritten by ideas of public safety and healthcare centered around whiteness. It is this utter I can come back to this, which is basically the end of my book. It is this utter abandonment of capital that frames how King Drew's program by the 90s eventually provided the military training for doctors before deployment to the Iraq War. Let me get that. That King Drew's Medicine's emergency department came to be a site for doctors to train for war only speaks to how America's emergency medical systems have adopted and resituated the infrastructure of military medicine, once temporally and spatially confined to foreign wars abroad, towards an elaborate peacetime medical infrastructure capable of tolerating warlike conditions domestically. It also speaks to how many white voters helped legislate everyday violence as an expected and natural feature of certain racialized spaces by redirecting taxes towards emergency medicine and prisons while dismantling the public health and welfare services for the poor. Thank you all. Ooh. Now I can take the jacket off.
So we have a good amount of time for questions. Anyone in the room, if you're trying to think of a question, you're welcome to ask anything. We also have about 20 people on the Zoom, so you can type in either the Q&A or the chat if you have a question, and then or you can raise your hand and we can call on you to speak in the room. But we'll start if anyone has any questions in the room. Please indicate as such. Do you have any what?
Not yet.
I can kind of get the ball. Okay, I guess I'll ask my first question. I want to ask about specific disease.
Sure.
The disease you mentioned most was heart attacks and sort of general cardiac disease. I'm wondering, how are people formulating newly like epidemiological change, especially AIDS, as like emergency compared to the individual emergency of a heart attack? Is this part of the page of the Han conception of what the emergency department's responsibility is to the population or to a neighborhood?
Well, I will say from the get-go, Han realizes that the way that he can offer a full complement of health services to remote regions is through all the funding that's happening around heart disease, cancer, and stroke, right?
Yes.
Through the regional medical programming funding. So he realizes that in order to give folks a whole wide range of health services that he knows he cannot provide through taxpayer support by way of a public hospital, he's going to try to get it through emergency medicine. So in his papers, it's very clear that he's like, he wants more applications outside of like these heart ambulance units, which is getting the main share of funding at the same time. I'll say to you that like AIDS configures differently in the paperwork, and quite honestly, like my other work around HIV/AIDS is more concerned about actually how like liberal, like civil rights oriented gay and lesbian activists use the rhetoric of policing to protect themselves in the HIV/AIDS crisis by trying to hire an out gay cop as a response to the HIV crisis. There's not, I did not look for how emergency medical systems respond to these new like diseases like HIV/AIDS. I do think that your question inspires all of us to think about how the field of emergency medicine and the types of like situations it's been applied for, like, is very capacious.
Yeah.
Right. You know, our earlier conversations about street medicine, like HIV/AIDS, like definitely is like on the radar for street medicine in this kind of emergency medicine way. You could think about like emergency medicine and helps evolve like the types of street medicine that you see was really centered around like the Black Panther clinics and these like health clinics. You could see like a very different iteration through it by the influence of like emergency medicine.
Yeah, so Nick, congrats on your book.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, that's great. And just wanted to take this moment to acknowledge Matt and Ben and Marcia and
Yes.
Leap and Marisol for making this event possible.
Yes, please.
So
Thank
we
you so much.
Really appreciate you know, really learning about your work. And I have like sort of like a meta question.
Sure.
So thinking about your work and the work that you shared, it seems to me that one of the inflection points or common thread is, you know, how do we work strategically to get public support on, so in this case, in terms of like emergency medicine. But as you know, we're, you know, going through a lot of crazy, challenging times at the moment where everything that we do is under attack. And, you know, one of the key examples that I wanted to highlight is currently there's a Senate Bill 895 that's proposing like a state bond for $23 billion. And it's we're working towards getting that on the bills so that, you know, when the election comes in November, hopefully it's going to pass.
Yeah.
But the question is, in terms of, so if I, you know, I mentioned this to like my colleague outside of UCLA, and he was saying, yeah, that's a lot of money.
Mhm.
And how do you think the public's going to react to supporting this? So there's a moment for us to really think about how do we message this and how do we provide proper like context and messaging so that like all the like-minded people like us, we support this bill, but like the voters have to really be convinced. And then in terms of thinking about, white voters versus, voters from the minoritized communities, I think different folks kind of rationalize this bill differently. So just wanted to get your comment on what are your thoughts about how should we prioritize and strategize in terms of working with that community?
This is a great question. It's one that I think we should all think about because I did not expect in writing the book that it would be a book about electoral politics. But after writing the book, after doing a full first draft, I realized, wait a minute, the ghost actor throughout the whole book are these white voters. And, I'm teaching right now this Health in the City course. My students are reading Nyan Shah's book. And they realize in order to get white voters in San Francisco to vote for public health measures, they use the Chinese as a scapegoat, right? If we don't pass this, the Chinese will kill us with their disease. And look at all this contagious disease, blah, 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 we need this. And so you could see like there could be a similar rhetoric, like we need to pass this thing because it's a public health emergency that we're doing and we're allowing all these people with diseases to run amok, right? Which is to appeal to someone's sense of safety, right? And really what I'm saying, their sense of property, like, you know what I mean? Myself and my neighborhoods and blah, blah, blah. I need all of these like contagious hordes or these like disease people who could like contaminate me. Like we need to pass this. And that's a public health emergency. The problem with that is that it uses the rhetoric of like, of like contagion and fear to get people to do the right thing, right? And really what we want, and so actually the kind of thing that's the more difficult thing is how do we have a conversation with people who are rich, have health insurance, that your health insurance don't work for you, and it sure as hell don't, right? Like poor people and people with health insurance, this healthcare system don't work for any of us. This is why when I teach Nancy Tom's book, Remaking the American Patient, it is a book full of people with health insurance and they ain't happy. They're not happy, so much so that they're going to Erewhon to get $20 smoothies because they think that's the solution for them. Because they can't trust doctors, they can't trust the pharmacy, right? Who they can trust, I don't know, is like some guy on TikTok, right? And that's what's so interesting about it is that this moment of like healthcare and capitalism show us healthcare is not working for anybody, right? And if we're going to fix it, it has to be something that we think of a radical solution, or else we're just going to keep doing the same thing, right? And that's a harder conversation. But I will say to us is that if it's true that what I'm saying, then elections are the litmus for us of what we're, right, where the public is. They give us the answer of what's the temperature. They also give us the venue about how to educate people about healthcare. This is why I like Daniel Hosang's work, because he's saying most people never take an ethnic studies class. They never take a gender and sexuality studies course. They never take, right? They don't learn like us nerds do. Where do they learn? They learn during elections. That's where they learn. They're educated on race. They're educated on gender. They're educated on sex through electoral discourse. Right? And so I want to like tell people we can't, yes, there's all these problems with electoral politics, but we cannot give it up. It is the largest venue for education. It is the largest venue for us to say, this is where we're at. Right? And when all these racist things and all these xenophobic things pass, guess what? That's telling us where the work is. So part of me, you know what I mean? Like, I mean, that's the crazy thing is I'm telling you that like in the 1960s, white voters were so spooked that they were like, we have to build this hospital, else they're going to riot again. Right? And that's the other, right? If you're not, people are taking the street, that's the other way that like you convince white voters to do something.
Yeah.
But you can see that has its limitations, right? All I'm just trying to say is writing the book made me be like, oh my gosh, like this is about electoral politics. And like, and if we're always, and that's the thing, like, sorry to diverge, I'll just show people like, if people of color, women, trans people, queer people were always organized at the margins of medicine and the margins of labor, the only way that we could ever come up with healthcare is it has to come through like big capital. That's the government, right? You know what I mean? Like the public has the purse. And so that has put all of us in a position, us being, queer people, women, right? Queer, people of color, we can't get in this capitalist society the scale of capital in order to like create true equality without having a way to leverage. We have to meet at scale. That means that we need more money, more capital. And that these Black leaders understood that in 1960s.
Yeah.
I can't get it through the free market. I can't get it through like organized medicine. We have to get it through the government.
Mhm.
And that put them in a kind of subservient position, right? In this political atmosphere. Now I can understand, like, yeah, you could see that I'm like really like mad at Tom Bradley, but I'm also being like, Tom Bradley did what he could do with the cards he was given. Right? Bad cards. We all know that now, but this is like, that's the lesson. Sorry to just go off on a tangent. You can see I'm like, this is where we're at.
I think it's like a point that was that this bill, this Senate bill, is going to be a ballot measure, is framed as like this California Institute of Sciences, right? It's a stopgap for the NIH retraction, and it's billed as essentially our funding for research for rare pediatric cancers, which is the sort of political lodestone of science. I found a new leukemia. Let me find a biologic therapy that costs $5,000 a month that will treat it. That is like the most politically weighty thing that the University of California can produce. Or like, it seems to be the lens which Scott Wiener, who wrote the bill, is sort of leveraging it, and it is like a great thing to be able to figure out rare leukemias. But it is so clear how that is like the type of this very specific type of whiteness that is allowed to be used to fund our universities. Because if a California Institute of Health is created with this massive capital project, much of it will go to funding like big wood tables and conference rooms like this. Because that's like actually what science is. It practically is the infrastructure. But
yeah, I think the challenge right now is, so we do have a long way to go, and it's like a bond. So kind of explaining this to like people in our community, our friends and neighbors. I think explaining it that way, some people might get it, but I think we need to make it much more concrete. So like we had like a suspended science fair where our colleagues were explaining like with a brain, like, so when somebody walks across and things like, how is that relevant to me? So we have to give like concrete examples, like our esteemed mathematician, Terrence Tao, his grant got terminated.
Yeah.
So you can explain his work, his mathematical model had a significant advances in MRI. So we all take MRIs, and the care that you get at the hospital for people with resources getting an MRI, that had a direct impact on the funding that the research had. So I think we need to make very concrete like connection in terms of your livelihood, your health has significant positive outcome because of all these research that we were able to do at UCLA and beyond. And people don't really realize, like, why do I have to care about like brain research? So I think that's the hard part.
Or the CalRx project, the state manufacturing insulin by itself, is in many ways a product of historians of health sciences research being like, by the way, the state can make insulin.
Hmm.
Everyone else does it. Like, it's actually not that hard.
Yeah.
We've had this technology for a long time. Those are kind of two parallel projects that are both sort of different political initiatives that are supposed to be responding to the same crisis.
Mhm.
Do we have another question in the chat?
I have a question.
Sure.
I have questions in the
Question
chat.
Matt.
Question in the mat. Yeah. Nick, thank you so much. This was amazing. It's like really cool to see this talk grow over the last 3 years, and I feel like, yeah, it's brain is buzzing. I feel like there's so much in the contemporary moment that we're kind of painting throughout the talk that I think are really clear. A question we used to be able to teach this through the medical school, which we can't now, but when we could teach this through the medical school, a question was always like asking students, like, why is it that we call 911 EMS is tied to the fire and the police? Like, really, like, how do we historically answer that question? I think you give us the seeds here of like understanding, like, it's always been a carceral project. It's always been about safety and policing. And I think and like LA has been a lab for that. So I think it's really important to kind of sit with that.
Mhm.
And I'm also thinking about like the like counter technology transferring between like Vietnam and like Korea here in the US, and like USC being complicit with using cadavers to train the IDF.
Yep.
We're still seeing all these different ways in which academic medicine is involved with militarism. And I think the question I have to kind of bring it back to like the abolitionist piece is, I think, like, again, you're kind of showing us like part of the reason why it's so hard to attempt abolition in the ER is because we're going against like something that's so deeply encoded in the ER, which is police. And something in the LA that we see a lot is that all the county hospitals have LA Sheriff Department stations in the ED. So I have like a specific question, which is like, did you come across like, when did that become a feature of the ER, especially in the county system? And like, what went into like, not just like having police as first responders, but actually putting sheriffs in all the EDs?
Oh, this is a hard question. One is the county has always had a jail inside. Big Jan has always had a jail inside of it. So the police have always been there. There's an uncomfortable answer. And this is the answer is overdetermined. This is like an academic way of saying there are multiple factors. But I will actually say that if you look at the bargaining contracts of all the unions, they begin to ask for security. And so I can imagine that some of that is a response to that. Particularly parking lots become a big issue in union contracts, which is a sort of like really tough and difficult discussion to have because, workers want to feel safe. They're also coming from the same neighborhoods in which their patients are. And so there's a really difficult conversation. I will say that I'm like, if people would love it, I want to talk to people about 911. It's actually, I'm working on an academic piece with several scholars on writing the history of 911. And particularly over this question, how does that staple one end of a growing part of the economy, which is healthcare, to another growing part of the economy, which is policing and prisons. And so 911 does that. It stitches both of them together. And you could see that it's really, how do I say this? Like there was a moment where I wanted to call the book Abolish Hospitals, and clearly like that would not work. Right? It would not work. But I think that if you follow carceral studies, is when they say abolish prisons, right? In the same way that people think about abolish slavery, who look at the abolition of slavery, it's like abolishing a type of society that would have slavery, a type of society that would have prisons, which is to say that we want to abolish a type of healthcare system that would have emergency medicine configured in this way, right? This is like the lesson that I have from like scholars of technology STS is that like, it's not the technology itself that is corrupted. It's how we arrive there, right? And I'll tell my students, like, we could be anti-medicine all you want in my classes, but when you have a headache, don't tell me you're not going to go for some Tylenol or Advil. I'm the first one, right? So part of it is that that's the challenge is how do we enter into a conversation with people? It's like, how did we accept having a medical system that brought wartime medicine to the home? Is that acceptable? That we're allowing like gun violence to run amok like this? You know what I mean? When people cannot get basic health care, like that's the problem. And you know, like I don't know what to say other than to say that like people understand that, you know, like they understand like, yeah, we don't, you know, and that's why I think that like gunshot wounds and stabbing, like all these mass shootings are so normalized because people are like, oh, we have emergency medicine. Like that's
Yeah.
what I think
Yeah.
about.
Yeah.
Like it's okay. Some of them are going to be saved. And put an entire society through trauma like that, trauma of a different kind. And I don't know, you know, like my friends who are from Europe say, yeah, like an ambulance in Europe is a van. Here it's a tank.
Yeah.
Mhm. The care rapid transport right there, the super special long ambulance
Yeah.
that parks right there.
You know, and the crazy thing is, I know EMS workers feel the same way about this. It shouldn't be like this, but it is. Thank you, Marcia, for the comment. And Charlotte, I love your work. I'm like very hardened. I teach your work all the time.
I have a question.
Sure, Megan.
Inspired by Ben's project and conversations about the spatial makeup, like the politics of space in Los Angeles
Yeah.
specifically. Is this story about the rise of this whole story, and especially the rise of emergency medicine, do you see that as specific to Los Angeles, or does it happen in other places but differently? Like, how does the way Los Angeles is laid out play into this?
I love this question because I get it a lot. And you can see that I use terms that when I go to like Atlanta, they're like, oh, this is Grady. When I go to Chicago, this is Cook.
Yeah.
Right? When I go to Houston, they're like, this is Ben Taub. Okay. Like, so there's King Drews everywhere. That's what I realized. And they all have a similar story, but differently situated given different like situations. I will say that like the very early adoption of emergency medicine in this way in LA is very special. It becomes a place where doctors train around a specialty around gunshot wounds and stabbing victims. A lot of people just ask, well, then why did King Drew, like, why did they close it? And part of me says is that just like if you follow the history of specialties, like specialties move on when they figure out like how to treat gunshot wounds. By the mid 80s, people are like, we have thoroughly done all the research we need to know about gunshot wounds and stabbing victims. In the same way, by the 80s and early 90s, they say we have everything we need to know about babies with chemical addiction, neonatal intensive care unit, like addiction by the 90s. So clearly by the early 2000s, people are like, King Drew has nothing new to offer in terms of research. Right? So this is where you get the LA Times saying, oh, it's poor care, it's bad care, because it no longer offers care that they can say is different from anybody else. It's tragic.
So this is getting to what Jay was talking about.
Yeah.
That the new research is what drives the existence of the hospital, not just the creation of new hospital.
Yeah, and to be honest, like, you know, the money makers for the medical school were the neonatal residency program and the emergency medicine department. So when the county decided to shut down and target those programs, it gutted Drew Medical School, right? You know, then we could talk about the politics of like medical schools and international medical grads and primary care specialties. Like, they don't make money for the university the way that these specialties do, right? Like, they can't guarantee 100% enrollment in those residency programs. And that is why it guts Drew Medical School's program. That leads then to the closure of King Drew. Yeah. I know, depressing story, you guys. I'm sorry.
No.
This is why my second project, I do not want to do something super depressing like this. Although people want the history. is what I'm learning.
Yeah.
They want to know. Yeah, actually, this last part is like, how do I tell the story of its closure?
How do cost care factor in your story? I'm really thinking about EMB's lens here and like medical inflation, priceflation.
My argument is the county board of supervisors decide to swallow the debt.
Yeah.
Because it helps all of the for-profit hospitals in LA stay afloat. It's like holding a bunch of debt so that other people can be profitable. So it just eats and eats, right?
Yeah.
Like they just eat and eat all the debt because they know it's actually like, you know, and so that's actually how I came to the project is that I was a union organizer for 6 years. I got sent to King Drew to help the hospital prevent its closure.
Mm-hmm.
And I took testimony from unionized resident physicians, and they said to the board of supervisors, if you close this hospital, it will cause the implosion of LA County's for-profit healthcare system. Because St. Francis don't want these patients, California Medical Center don't want these patients, right?
Mm-hmm.
And as a historian, I went back and looked at what were the deals that were cut between all of these hospitals and the county. The county said, we won't fund King Drew anymore, but we'll fund you to take these patients through these contracts. And remember, these hospitals are way more selective, right? So they'll take the ones that they can think they can get the funding for, and they'll be quiet on everything else, right? And so this is the issue at hand, which is if you actually look at the numbers of uninsured in LA County, they are exponential. So this is why LA County actually has still kept, right, all of its public hospitals because it knows it cannot, if it just leaves all indigent patients to the wind, that all of these indigent patients would come and they would come to the door of Cedars-Sinai. They would come to the door of St. Francis and in huge numbers. In a way that would, this is what like Paige is saying, it's going to bankrupt our, right? And so that's like the problem, right? And what I'm saying to you is Bradley and his folks said, actually, maybe we can use healthcare services to anchor working poverty in a way that we can actually turn like, right? Workers will move on from a place if they feel like there's nothing there for them. No good jobs, no healthcare, no housing, move on. And he says, if I give them some public housing, some public healthcare, they'll say, I'll stay in LA and not move to Detroit. I'll stay in LA and not move to Las Vegas. Why? Because I can still survive here. Barely, but I can still survive here. And so this is how I'm thinking about why would LA County consciously go into debt?
Yeah.
Why? Because it doesn't want all these multinational companies to ever leave. Right? It is literally the Walmarting, it's making LA a company town without making it a company town. And when I started as a union organizer, that's how we talked about LA. LA is a company town. And I didn't really understand it until I finished this book. I was like, what are they talking about?
And I'll say it.
You know what I mean? Like, what are they talking about? But that's what they're talking about. You know? Particularly the Justice for Genders campaign, all the organizers knew that the workers were most upset that they could not afford healthcare to go to a regular hospital, a quote unquote regular hospital, community hospital. Jay, perfect. Yes. Thank you.
I can do another question.
Sure.
Anyone else in the room have a question?
Yeah, please other people too.
Yeah, it's a radical different way of thinking about it's not actually, it's about actually taking on debt to make others profitable.
Yeah.
That's what takes people aback because they're like, oh, okay, right? You know, and the training programs for medical students and residents. Yeah.
But in like in the other cities, this is within the same hospital system.
Yeah.
Like in Pittsburgh, University of Pittsburgh Medical Center has a like the emergency room as its debt leader.
Yeah.
To maintain the consent of governing
Right.
of like doing the service of health in the city.
Right.
LA has just separated the county system to just absorb the losses so that Cedars and UCLA can.
Right. And part of it is too, is that people have tricked themselves into thinking that the University of California hospital system is somehow public, when it actually is private. Because it's not held to the same California law where it has to take indigent patients. They can refuse. And this is like the cash cow for University of California. You can say we're a public facing institution, but act like a private employer and corporation. And this is why, Ben, your work is going to be really important, is this whole USC UCLA divide, right? Is UCLA has always acted like it has Harbor and it has Reagan, or as they used to call it, University Hospital, right? And USC just hitched its wagon to like county, didn't allow all taxpayers to basically fund and build its entire medical campus. UCLA decided differently, right? And the winner is UCLA, right? Because people all over the world go to UCLA, and USC just barely is getting there. Sorry, USC, but that's the truth, right? You know?
Yeah.
But that's why I think your work is going to be really potentially important, because it's showing folks that all these people who were in the business of working with public entities all of a sudden said, oh, we have to get out. And if we don't get out, we have to right? And so USC now mirrors UCLA's health system by Harbor, right? Because now it has Keck and county. UCLA has always from the get-go had these two, right? A private entity that can make large money, and a public entity where it can circulate all of its medical trainees, students, residents through, so that you get a full spectrum of healthcare, right? Continuity of care, all of that stuff that if you just had Reagan, you would never see, right?
Yeah.
And then UCLA also has a colonial relationship to Drew,
Mhm.
which is that for a long time, that UCLA would take the first cut of applicants and then give the rest to Drew. Woo! Okay, I'm gonna stop. I'm gonna stop because y'all are like paying for my trip here.
No, we love it. We love it. I was gonna ask, and maybe this is more of a hopeful note we can end on.
Sure.
So you kind of you flashed the Pittsburgh Freedom House on one of the slides.
Yep.
I'm just curious, like as you were kind of going through this, and like as there was like a city county kind of driven plan of like this is how we're gonna approach attending to gunshot wounds and emergency needs. Did you come across any more autonomous concurrent community experiments in U.S. response that were kind of like happening at the same time, kind of contesting it, kind of like things that were happening outside of like how were other groups responding to the same kind of need?
The Panthers, there's evidence, Young Lords, they all have evidence of trying to do similar things around patient transport services. Money honey, like that's what I tell people. At the end of the day, it's about money honey and the energy of people. In LA, it's hard because the Panthers basically get quite literally bombed out in LA. Shot up not only by had rivals not only in the Black nationalist movement, but like had heavy COINTELPRO. So it's harder to see. They have the vision. They know it's important. They don't have the money and the energy and the resources to be able to mount that. Yeah. So that's you can imagine that there are. It's hard because my project was on LA. I just know that there's other people who've worked on that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyone have any last words? Join me in thanking Nick for this wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for attending. Thank you. Exciting event. I'm glad we could grow this together. And thank you to the Center for Social Medicine for hosting us. And I hope everyone can.
Yeah. Thank you, Marisol,
yeah.
for everything.
The event tomorrow. There's also an event tomorrow.
Oh, yeah.
Nick will be talking at All Power Books tomorrow.
Yes. 7 p.m.
7 p.m. at All Power Books
West
on
Adams.
West Adams. Anyone is welcome. No art can be needed. Just roll up. And then you'll be talking at USC on Wednesday, I believe.
Yes, I can't remember at 3 or 4. Yes, you can find me somewhere on Instagram or Blue Sky.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for coming.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
And then we have like 10 boosters left and 1 donut.
Please, yeah.
I don't have to carry them all.
Thank you. Whose is
This
this?
is mine.
And then Zoom folks, I'm gonna conclude the call and turn off all the microphones. Can you throw me that mouse? Stop. Go.